So moving on now, we're going to start talking about connective tissue, which is our second tissue type that we're going to cover. So some characteristics of connective tissue. All connective tissues are going to have cells, and there's different types of cells that we'll talk about. They're going to have protein fibers, which there's three types, and then some type of ground substance. And the ground substance is what's in the kind of in the background of the cells and the fibers. Together, the fibers and the ground substance are termed the extracellular matrix, and because they're everything in addition to the cells. So connective tissues, unlike epithelial tissues, do not occur on free surfaces, so they're always going to be surrounded by something. And most of them, with a couple of exceptions, are highly vascular, meaning they have lots of blood vessels. So this is a picture of classic connective tissue. This looks like what we would call areolar connective tissue, which you'll see, but these are the different fibers that you see. So the fiber types are collagen, elastic, and reticular. We'll talk about those. You see lots of different cells in the background. Most common that you'll see are fibroblasts, which are cells that look like this. Here's some fat cells called adipocytes. And then all of the stuff in the background is the ground substance. So classification of connective tissue, I would keep referring back to this outline because there's a lot of different connective tissues, and this is a way to kind of keep it organized. So we're going to talk about subtypes such as loose, dense. We'll talk about cartilage, bone, and then blood. Blood is also a connective tissue. So the cells that can be found throughout connective tissue are fibroblasts, which secrete extracellular matrix of other tissues, adipocytes, which are fat cells, macrophages, which phagocytize things. That basically means they eat things. Mast cells secrete substances called histamine and heparin. Histamine is a vasodilator, meaning that it dilates blood vessels, and heparin is a blood thinner, meaning it thins the blood a little bit. So both of these are involved in inflammation and an inflammatory response. Plasma cells are another cell you might see in connective tissue. They secrete antibodies, which are good things, fight off bad things that could get into the body. Leukocytes, which are white blood cells, play a huge role in immunity, in your immune system. Mesenchymal cells are the stem cells that we already discussed. So the fibers that you might find in connective tissue are a little bit simpler. There's only three. So collagen fibers, which are really common. They're made up of protein called collagen. Very strong, do not stretch. So these are kind of like iron rods, like really, really strong. Elastic fibers are made up of a protein called elastin, and based on its name, you could guess what it does. It stretches a lot, so it has elastic properties. And then reticular fibers are made of some collagen and some glycoproteins. It's very tough and flexible, and you mainly find reticular tissue in lymphatic organs, and it forms a supporting framework known as the stroma. So stroma is the supporting framework within lymphatic organs, such as your spleen. So the ground substance is kind of like I said, the background substance. So it could be fluid, like if you're talking about blood. Could be solid if you're talking about something like bone, or it could be more in between, like a gel-like consistency like you find in cartilage. So it contains different chemicals, glycoproteins, this group called glycosaminoglycans. Hyaluronic acid is a common one, chondroitin sulfate. But these are all chemicals that are found throughout the ground substance of connective tissues. So what we're going to do now is kind of move into that outline that I put up there. So we're going to go through the different connective tissues that you need to be able to identify and know a little bit about. So key points are going to be identification of the connective tissue, location, so where is it found, and anything else that is important I'll mention. So we're going to start with loose connective tissue, and the first one is under loose is areolar. So lots of different fibers. They're loosely arranged. This is a great picture of it right here. This is a great microscope slide. It's found in a lot of different places all over the body, but one of the places that is shown here is the dermis of the skin. So remember I mentioned previously that the skin had two layers, an epidermis, which was epithelial tissue, and then this dermis, which is connective tissue. So there's actually two parts to the dermis. We'll learn more about this when we cover the integumentary system, but one of those parts is made up of areolar. And you can clearly see the different fibers, the cells. Most of these cells you're seeing here are fibroblasts. All right, next tissue type is adipose. So adipose is basically fat tissue. So the cells are called adipocytes. They store fat in the form of molecules called triglycerides. So triglycerides are our storage form of fat, and they're loaded into these adipocytes. So microscope-wise, this is a pretty good picture of it down here. And so it kind of looks almost like shattered glass, but each of those round substances is an adipocyte. And the last tissue under loose is reticular, and contains reticular fibers, some leukocytes, which are white blood cells, fibroblasts are common in there too. So like we said earlier, forms the stroma of lymphatic organs, or its supporting framework. Identification wise, it always kind of looks like dark, stringy looking fibers. So just kind of twisted little fibers, and that kind of is the identifiable feature of reticular tissue. So those dark, stringy looking fibers. Moving to the next category, we have dense connective tissue, and there's three here. So the first one is going to be called dense regular. So it consists of collagen fibers that are parallel. So they look kind of wavy in this picture, which is fine, but the key point is the collagen fibers are running parallel to one another. So that is why it's called dense regular. And you can see how densely packed they are, which is why this is under the topic of dense. So collagen, remember, is very strong. So you find this dense regular connective tissue where you need lots of strength. So the big places that you find it are tendons, which is connective tissue that connect muscle to bone. You need lots of strength there. Ligaments are great examples of this also. And that's what's shown in this picture. These are tendons connecting muscle to bone. The ligaments, on the other hand, connect bone to bone. And then we have dense irregular. So dense irregular also has collagen fibers, but they're irregularly arranged. So they're kind of going all over the place. So you don't get that clean parallel look. So it looks more like this. So collagen fibers all over the place. And it's also found in the dermis of the skin. So remember, the dermis of the skin we said had areolar. It's also going to have dense irregular. And actually most of the dermis of the skin is going to be dense irregular. And then the last connective tissue under the category of dense is elastic. So it has elastic fibers, also lots of fibroblasts. And so again, you see how packed in the fibers are, which is why it's under dense. But these elastic fibers stretch, and so we find it in places where we need to stretch. Probably the best example we have a few, but a big one is our big blood vessels. Like this is the aorta of the heart. This is a big red blood vessel. So when blood comes out of the left side of the heart, it goes into the aorta, and you need it to stretch a little bit so it doesn't get damaged. So we have elastic connective tissue there. And so dark wavy lines is a good way to describe what this looks like. So moving on to supporting connective tissue, we have cartilage. Cartilage is kind of its own animal. It has its own terminology. So I'm going to give you some basic characteristics before we name the different types. So it has a gel-like extracellular matrix. The cells have their own names. They're called chondrocytes. So site means cell, chondro means cartilage. The chondrocytes are going to lie in spaces called lacunae, kind of like little pockets where these cells live. And there's cartilage is avascular, meaning it doesn't have blood vessels. So that's different from other types of connective tissue. So cartilage is the only connective tissue that does not have blood vessels. And it may or may not have a substance called a perichondrium. So a perichondrium would be an outer covering going around the cartilage. And some cartilages have it, some don't, and that's all you need to know. As far as when we go through the different examples, I'll tell you either it has a perichondrium or it doesn't. So starting with the most common type of cartilage, it's called hyaline. It's common. It's also the weakest. It has collagen fibers, but they don't show up in the microscope slides. Has a perichondrium. It's found a lot of different places. So some in the nose, some on the ends of bones, like where bones meet up with in joints, where bones meet other bones. You need a little bit of cushion there. That's hyaline cartilage. The trachea has some hyaline cartilage. The ribs have some hyaline cartilage on there where it meets with where they meet with the sternum. So what you're seeing in this picture is these cells are called chondrocytes, and they're lying in little spaces called lacunae. And so one identifiable feature about hyaline cartilage is that it looks really smooth, almost like stained glass with little air bubbles in it. That's what it always looks like. So really smooth. You don't see any fibers. Fibrocartilage, on the other hand, you do see fibers. It has collagen fibers, really strong. This is the strongest type of cartilage, so we find it where we need lots of strength. In most microscope slides, not all, but most, it tends to stain blue. So that's one hint. And so you still get a chondrocytes lying in a lacuna. You see the fibers and really strong. You find this where you need strength. So that may be the intervertebral disc, so between your vertebra. The pubic symphysis, which is a little piece of fibrocartilage where your hip bones meet in the front. And then another place is, I don't have listed here, but the meniscus or menisci, if you're talking about plural, if you're talking plural, it is found in the knee. So your knee has lots of cartilage in it, and you have these little discs called menisci. So that's also fibrocartilage. Then the last type of cartilage is called elastic. And elastic is identifiable by elastic fibers. So you see fibers. You still see the chondrocytes lying in lacunae. And so this has a little more stretch to it because it has elastic fibers. So it does have a perichondrium. And just to go back for a moment, I didn't say this, but it was up on the slide. The fibrocartilage does not have a perichondrium. Elastic and hyaline do. So where do we find this? External ear. So if you think your ear flaps back and forth, if you move your ear, it'll pop right back. Something called the epiglottis is a good place for it too, which prevents food from going down the airways. And also the ear canals, auditory tubes. So moving into bone. So bone is kind of its own topic too. So it has its own terminology. So it has a solid extracellular matrix. Collagen fibers give it its strength. Calcium phosphate give bone its hardness, and mainly calcium. The cells of bone are called osteocytes. So cyte meaning cell, osteo meaning bone, and it's very strong. And its strength, again, comes from those collagen fibers. And similar to cartilage, bone has an outer covering called a periosteum. All right, so there's two major types of bone. There's what we call spongy bone, and there's what we call compact bone. We are going to do an entire chapter on bone tissue coming up, so this is just to kind of scratch the surface a little bit. But spongy bone is found mainly on the inside of the bone. So this would be the outside here. This is more the inside where there's a cavity. And it kind of looks like a sponge. So if you look at this, it looks like spongy bone. This is spongy bone. It looks kind of like a sponge. You get these little pockets in it. In reality, in those pockets, it looks like there's air, but in reality, there's bone marrow in there. So those are the spaces I'm talking about. And then compact bone looks like this, and we can zoom in on one of these things. It looks like this. This is actually a microscope slide of compact bone. So it forms the outer part of most bones. The units that it's made up of, these round circles, are called osteons. And you can see there's concentric rings that make up the osteon. Those are called lamellae. And there's different types of lamellae. We'll get more into that when we do the bone chapter. So there's a canal in the middle where you have blood vessels and nerves passing through. That's called the Haversian canal, also known as the central canal. And the bone cells, like we said, are called osteocytes. And they, just like cartilage, they lie in spaces called lacunae. So you can't really see it that well in this picture because it's a microscope slide, but these dark spots are supposed to be chondrocytes. And you can just envision them sitting in a space called a lacunae. And then lastly, you get these tiny little canals radiating off of those lacunae, and it kind of looks like cracks in the bone, but those are called canaliculi. They're just tiny canals that allow the osteocytes to communicate with each other. So moving now to blood. Blood is a connective tissue. We'll do an entire chapter on blood later, so this is just to introduce blood to you. So in general, blood consists of cells and then the fluid that they sit in. So the fluid is called plasma. That's the water portion of the blood. And then the formed elements are the cells. And there's three types. There's erythrocytes, which are these pinkish structures that kind of look like donuts. Those are erythrocytes, also known as red blood cells. Their big job is to carry oxygen. Leukocytes, or the white blood cells, those are those bigger purple cells. They have a key role in immunity, so leukocytes or white blood cells. And then thrombocytes, also known as platelets, you see one here, look like little tiny specks. Those have a job to clot the blood. So if you're bleeding, your blood should clot. That's due to these platelets or thrombocytes. So that's blood. So what we've done so far, we've covered epithelial, we've covered connective tissue, and so there's two more, muscle and nervous. And like I said, I'm just going to kind of introduce muscle and nervous to you because we will do multiple chapters on these later in the semester. So muscle tissue has its own terminology. So muscle cells are called muscle fibers. Muscle tissue has the ability to contract or contractility. So what that means is it has the ability to generate force. So when muscle contracts, it generates force. There's three types of muscles: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth, that we'll run through really quick. Skeletal muscle is the muscle that attaches the bone. It's mainly responsible for movement. So skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated, meaning they have a lot of nuclei. They have a striped appearance when you look through a microscope, just like this picture. And we'll talk later about why those stripes exist, but it has to do with the filaments that are inside skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is voluntary, meaning we have voluntary control over it. We decide when it's going to contract. And then, again, like we said, it's attached to bones, and it's primarily responsible for movement. Cardiac muscle is also striated. You can't really see the striations that well in this picture, though. Involuntary. It's found in the heart, obviously. It's called cardiac muscle. And 1 to 2 nuclei per cell. The fibers tend to be branched to allow them to work closely together. And also in cardiac muscle, you get the cells held together by intercalated disc. So intercalated disc are actually a combination of 2 intercellular junctions that we've discussed. So main one is gap junctions. So you remember gap junctions, and also desmosomes. But the gap junctions of the intercalated disc basically allow the cardiac muscle cells to rapidly communicate with each other. So you get the heart contracting as a unit as opposed to each cell contracting on its own. And then last type of muscle, we have smooth muscle. So it's not striated. It's involuntary, so we don't have voluntary control over it. 1 nucleus per cell. The cells tend to have a fusiform appearance or spindle shape. What that means is kind of like this. If we zoom in maybe on this muscle cell, so it's kind of tapered on the ends and fat in the middle. So that's what smooth muscle cells look like. So we find this in places like the digestive tract, where we need to contract a little bit to get stuff through. Blood vessels, so they can constrict and dilate. So lots of smooth muscle there. Also, many organs have lots of smooth muscle to help them contract. All right, and then lastly, our last tissue type, nervous tissue. Again, we'll do this in a lot more detail later, but just to introduce it, within nervous tissue, there's 2 major cell types. There's neurons and there's neuroglial cells. Neurons do the communication work, so they send electrical signals called action potentials, and it basically allows different parts of the body to communicate with each other. So if we look at a neuron, there's 3 major parts to a classic neuron. There's a cell body, which is called the soma. So that's the main part. Most neurons are going to have one long extension called an axon that you see here. And an axon's job is to send out those action potentials. So send out information. So action potentials are sent on the axons going away. And then the dendrites are all these other extensions, and they receive information. So the receiving end or receptive portion of a neuron are the dendrites, this sending out portion, the output portion, is called the axon. So, and then we have the supporting cells, which are called neuroglial cells. There's 6 different types. We'll discuss those in detail later, but they have a variety of roles depending on which one you're talking about. But their main job is to do supporting work. They do not send the electrical signals like the neurons do. And you can see some neuroglial cells here. So there are a lot more neuroglial cells than there are neurons.